Welcome back, everyone, to the nutrition session. I'm going to throw the mic over to Michael Zemel. He is our Connexum Chief Scientific Officer, as well as the founder of NuSirt Biopharma. Michael, take it away, please.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. If I could have my slides up, I have a brief opening set of slides. If I believe that they're supposed to be up. If not, what I shall do is I will instead share my own screen with apologies. Well, there we go. I'm attempting to go to projection mode. There we go. So it is a pleasure to welcome you to our Nutrition and Optimizing Healthy Longevity panel. I'm especially pleased to be joined by my colleagues who I can no longer see because my slides have taken over my screen. I have a set of distinguished colleagues who have joined us. John Flack is Chair of Internal Medicine at Southern Illinois University. I've known John for a very long time. Philippe Gut is department head at Nestle Institute of Health Sciences. Philip Home, professor of diabetes medicine at Newcastle, and David Ludwig, professor of nutrition and professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. I will tell you that each of them has additional titles, but they would have filled up this slide and then one additional slide, I think. And providing a full and proper introduction for each would take up a good chunk of the time allotted to this panel. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to spend the next 3 to 4 minutes setting the stage for our discussion, after which each of our panelists will spend a few moments providing some opening remarks to frame their perspective on the topic, and then we'll engage in what I expect will be a robust and stimulating discussion. So we plan to address 3 main questions in our discussion. First, can we untangle the health span effects of obesity from the effects of diet quality? Simply put, if we could succeed in reducing energy intake by, for example, 20%, while maintaining a highly processed diet dominated by low quality carbohydrates and sugar sweetened beverages, would that be a health span victory? Or would it not? We'll try to draw some lessons from what I characterize as edge cases, the so-called metabolically healthy obesity and metabolically obese normal weight. Some of these have been tangentially referenced in earlier talks today. Second, what is the evidence that fasting protocols, whether we're talking about alternate day fasting or time-restricted eating or any of the other protocols, provides an advantage over energy restriction for either weight management, health span, or lifespan in humans? And finally, does our current public health nutrition policy really match the best science, or have we missed the mark, especially in our recommendations for dietary sugars, saturated fat, and sodium? Now, what is interesting is we sort of have a front row seat in watching a nutrition transition in real time. Most developed countries underwent a nutrition transition to some version of our current Western diet, starting 70 or more years ago, with subsequent alterations, of course, occurring more or less incrementally over time and probably still occurring. China, on the other hand, has been unfolding a nutrition transition in waves right before our eyes in real time. And there are likely, I think, lessons that we can learn from our front row seats. The transition from a planned food supply overlaid by a great famine in the late 50s to early 60s, to a market-driven, abundant food supply in the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond, has led to an extremely rapid shift to a Western diet. While we certainly don't want to confuse correlation with causality, this is about as close as you're going to get to a smoking gun in nutritional epidemiology, with a 10-fold increase in obesity prevalence and an 18-fold increase in diabetes prevalence directly associated with this transition in a very short period of time. This is obviously causing a public health crisis, much as it is elsewhere. And so we shall see, I think, from our front row seats, how the new prevention guidelines just introduced last year, how effective they may be in reversing these trends. Now, I said we would look at edge cases, and so I want to just set this up for discussion during the panel. What about metabolically healthy obesity? I know it's been argued that this term is a misnomer and that it's not truly healthy. There are nonetheless a significant number of obese individuals, something between 10 and 20%, who don't exhibit the cardiometabolic risk that you would predict from their BMI, and instead are not insulin resistant, not hypertensive, don't have elevated lipids. As you can see from the slide, these are individuals who are characterized by lower visceral fat relative to subcutaneous fat and lower, lower liver fat. Now, it's true that many of them will ultimately transition from metabolically healthy obesity to metabolically unhealthy obesity. It's also true that some don't. It may be argued, has been argued, that metabolically unhealthy obesity is in large part a failure of the subcutaneous adipose tissue to expand properly in response to energy overload. Instead depositing in visceral depots and non-adipose tissue depots. And so at that point, you make a transition to unhealthy obesity. The flip side of that, of course, is metabolically obese normal weight, which is characterized by very similar limitation of subcutaneous fat's ability to expand, again, leading to a deposition of lipid in visceral adipose and non-adipose tissue, such as the liver, even in individuals with healthy low BMIs. All of this leads us back to our question of whether there may be dietary patterns that help preserve a non-pathological adipose tissue function, even at elevated BMI. If so, should we focus unrelentingly only on reducing BMI? Is BMI more than a biomarker? Or should we be focused on reducing unhealthy fat? Finally, I'd like to just to set the stage, and this will be, you will hear more about this shortly. I'd like to address fasting protocols. As shown in the ovals, there's little doubt that there's overlap between the benefits of generalized caloric restriction and benefits of intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating. There's also clear evidence in animal models pointing to non-overlapping benefit of intermittent fasting in, if you will, flipping a metabolic switch. Now, I know that fasting protocols are likely popular with many of the folks attending this conference, and by way of full disclosure, that includes myself. However, the question I want to raise here is, do we have sufficient clinical data to support the same kinds of claims in humans? That is, claims for non-overlapping benefit, or is the benefit primarily one of generalized caloric restriction? And if so, do we know what the optimal regimen is? Do we know whether it's alternate day fasting or is time-restricted feeding enough? And if it's time-restricted feeding enough, is it 16-8, 14-10, or something else? And does the timing matter, as was suggested by a paper published in Nature about 2 weeks ago? Fruit flies, not humans, to be sure, nonetheless persuasively showing that early day fasting is linked to longevity while late day fasting is not. So what are the implications for our own practices and recommendations? We'll hear more about this from our panel. And with that, I am going to back away and bring on, let's see, stop screen sharing. There we go. And I am now going to ask John Flack to step up virtually and offer a few opening remarks. John?
Okay. Do I have to share my screen with my slides?
If they're not popping up, I would ask you to do so. There we go. There they are.
You got them?
There we go. Yes, they're on screen. Thank you.
So welcome all. I'll just say a few words about a controversial area, an area that I worked in for a couple of decades before I moved to some other things, a topic that for me as a hypertension specialist is of keen importance. And I think it's also important for our health. And I'm going to talk really today about sodium, dietary sodium. And one, I would say that when we talk about dietary sodium as an isolated factor in our diet, it's really artificial because there's a lot of relationships, both positive and negative, with sodium with other nutrients, including calories. This is from a paper Minty published recently that talks about populations in the world, and the vast majority of people consume between about 3 to 5 grams of sodium. And that what you can do is, if you look at cardiovascular risk, mortality risk, it tends to go up at the high end and also up at the low end. Now, even though this looks symmetrical, certainly there are far more people on the higher end than on the lower end. Because down below about 3 grams a day, you're talking about 10-15% or less of people in the free living population.
Send an email to Saeed and the administrator to see if he can advance it.
The other thing is that you really have recommendations from AHA, WHO, which are definitely much lower than that 3 gram per day threshold, where at least epidemiologic studies have said that there is kind of the nadir of risk before it really starts elevating. And so the question is, are we recommending too low a dietary sodium intake? My take on this is that the studies of the relationship between dietary sodium intake and outcomes of clinical benefit and harm are really significantly flawed. One, many of these studies are epidemiological, and with epidemiology, yeah, you can infer causation, but you can't prove it, at least not as well as you can with experiments. There's a lot of nutrient calorie collinearity with sodium intake, and also too, the studies showing benefit primarily through blood pressure lowering and some suggesting harm are relatively short term. And I think an important fact has been that the observation of harm below a low sodium intake threshold gets conflated with causing harm by reducing sodium intake from higher levels to below these thresholds. And those are entirely different things. And finally, at what level should sodium intake be reduced to, in whom, and how? Because there are clear questions of feasibility. Here's just a great example of one of the problems you have with low sodium intake and relating it to an exposure. So low sodium intake has been associated with increased mortality and also increased cardiovascular risk. Yet, if you actually look in the NHANES in almost 40,000 people over a 15-year period of time, you see that in sodium quintiles, the average sugar intake is substantially lower at higher intakes of sodium and higher at lower intakes of sodium. And so again, this is a problem of collinearity. Is it sodium or is it something else? This is a fascinating study by Bodie. It's an experimental study where radio-labeled ANG1 was used to determine ANG2 generation on various sodium diets: low sodium, normal sodium, high sodium. The backdrop here is that we've heard repeatedly that low sodium diet just shocks the system, activates the renin-angiotensin system. And that's really done by looking at, or determined by looking at aldo and renin, which tend to go up when you go on a low sodium diet. When you look at tissue ANG1 and ANG2 formation on a low sodium diet, it's really undetectable. You really just are not generating ANG2. You generate more on a normal sodium diet, and on a high sodium diet, you generate more ANG1 and ANG2, which is very different than what you would come to believe just simply looking at a circulating biomarker like renin. So at the tissue level, it looks like the renin-angiotensin system really becomes active in the sense of at least ANG2 formation the higher the level of sodium, despite the fact that there were no differences in blood pressure between these groups, and renin was suppressed. And finally, this is a targeted look at people with resistant hypertension, a very important high-risk hypertension subgroup. Crossover study done years ago at University of Alabama, Birmingham, basically showing that within a very short period of time, a week or so, that you would get literally 20 plus millimeter of mercury reductions in systolic blood pressure with dietary sodium loading. So those are all my slides. I would say this is really a Rorschach ink blot area where you can see what you want to see. There is room for people on both sides of this argument. I tend to believe that the science has really not gotten too far, the recommendations have not gotten too far ahead of the science. I think that certainly 2.5, 3 grams per day in free living people, there's just no physiologic basis or rationale for why you would need nearly that much sodium. Targeted 1,500 a day or less, maybe in people with hypertension, heart failure. So that's what I'll say for now. Clearly, this will probably stimulate some debate, and look forward to it.
Thank you very much, John. I'm very much looking forward to discussing some of those points as the panel opens. Excellent presentation, thank you. We will shift now to Philippe Gut. And Philippe, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I ask you to correct me, but hopefully I've got it right.
Michael, that was perfect.
Good.
Thank you.
I try. And you'll be sharing your slides directly from your own screen, correct?
I will. It doesn't matter. I will. Let me share them. And you tell me if you see them.
There they are.
All right. In full screen mode. Good. So yeah, I want to start with a kind of a zoom out perspective on what we talk about when we talk about food demand globally. And the reason I put up the slide is because as the audience of this Metabesity conference, you will see that aging is right at the center of global food demand among many factors. And so here, if you look at the slide, the upper row, you see important demographic and social changes. And in the upper row, you see the impact that they have on nutrition and food demand worldwide. And one of the reasons I put this up is because I think in many sessions here, we discuss very high-end solutions to the aging problem, all the way from the extreme spectrum of gene therapy, but even pharmaceuticals, are also quite in a way, an extreme solution if you look globally. And so from the left to right, I mean, you will see, one of the factors driving global food demand is just population growth worldwide. And this comes with challenges like food shortage and nutritional imbalance. So, away from only malnutrition in countries that don't have, enough access to food for the whole population, but also, what's called obese malnutrition, people that have enough to high caloric food, but it's often very low in micronutrients and fiber. So you have essentially a hidden malnutrition in many people in the world. And then maybe jumping to the middle column, which is at the core of this discussion. So yes, the populations are aging, and we're looking in pretty extreme scenarios in some countries in the world where we're looking into 40% people over 65 in a few years from now. And with this comes, of course, health concerns, and this is why we're all here. So how can we prevent them? And one of the impact that this has in terms of innovation and research is how can we personalize diet here from the food perspective to address aging and healthy aging and health concerns. And so this is really becoming a key element. And then, of course, personalization is a very broad spectrum that we can discuss later. And then I think a third point I want to highlight is on the right is the wealth of information and digital information that people have that they can use to have access to knowledge about food and health and how this helps them to stay young and healthy. And this also then impacts, of course, the way they consumers purchase food and nutrition solutions. So from here, maybe now one important point to make here is if we look traditionally into nutrition solutions and healthy aging, we look at the right end of the spectrum, meaning old people, frail old people, sarcopenic old people. We look from a malnutrition perspective, what are the gaps, let's say, in protein intake, in micronutrient intake. But the reality is, it's just the spectrum has become so much larger when we think of how can we provide the right solutions for healthy aging. And today it goes really much to the left. So we think of healthy aging now in people in the 40s. And with this comes also a change from reactive healthcare to proactive health management. People want to take care of their health, and this is really important. It's something that started before COVID, but with COVID, people are much more aware that they can be healthy today, but then there can be this shock or this event that really stretches the resilience of a person. So with here, so this means going from frailty, malnutrition, high protein. There's a whole now range of solutions that consumers and then patients are also are seeking that go much more in the preventive nutrition space, and even to the point where it's not only about food and nutrition solutions, but also behavior patterns when it comes to food, like you just mentioned, intermittent fasting. In the overlapping with chrononutrition, people start thinking of what day, time of the day should I eat? Should I skip breakfast? Should I skip dinner? Should I not skip anything at all? Should I, be more careful with snacking and so on? So there's a whole change also, not just of what is eaten, but also the behavior around food intake. And then I just want to end on a little bit more scientific note here, and put out a bit of a question that is, I think, at the core why we're all here, and that I would love to discuss more. And this is a bit the question: how healthy are healthy older adults? And here I'm just sharing a snippet of a recent clinical trial where we went to really great length trying to recruit very healthy older people. So you see on the left here a few points about this cohort. So we recruited people in average 65 of age with a BMI of 28, where you could say, well, this is overweight, but it actually represents the mean in this age group when you go into larger epidemiological data sets. And so here's a comparison. We had a group of young, healthy 20 to 40-year-olds, and you can see that the subjects, and this is not surprising, I'm not telling secrets here, these are things that you find in many studies. You see elevated blood triglycerides, cholesterol, insulin resistance, and increased HbA1c, higher levels of inflammation. And for us, it was interesting because really we worked with a partner clinical side that is really specialized in diabetes trials, and really they have very experienced staff to look into, to exclude people that are, have diabetes, that have other types of diseases, chronic diseases. So really we tried to recruit non-smokers, no hypertension. Really, we went for the healthy ones, and still you see these changes, obviously. And then on the right, just two examples also, because we're talking about aging, and the free radical theory of aging is still one of the main pathomechanisms are believed to be important for the aging process. And you can see that even in this very healthy population, you see a reduced glutathione buffer system. Glutathione is a metabolite that can buffer oxidative stress in cells. And then on the right, linked to that, like a really substantially increased level of total cysteine, which is also a marker of a pro-oxidative environment that has been linked previously with an elevated risk for cardiovascular disease. And these are just a few snippets here, but it's really to put out the question: if a 60-year-old goes to see a doctor and the doctor sees the patient going towards type 2 diabetes, is it the right answer of the doctor to say, you're doing pretty well for your age, or can we do more? So this is a bit the question I want to put out here. So thank you.
Philippe, thank you very much. Again, very interesting. I think we're going to have a very stimulating discussion. I will invite Philip home.
Thank you very much. And Thank you, Michael and Thomas and others for inviting me to take part. I'm not presenting any slides here, so you'll have to listen to me and concentrate. I'll also apologize a little bit for my voice, perhaps, as I've got a bit of an allergic cough, not COVID. My background is that of a diabetes physician with an interest in clinical trials and new medications, but also with a research background in metabolism. And that's led me really away from thinking of obesity as the underlying problem in the development of the vascular inflammation that Flack was just talking about, but rather thinking in terms of excess calorie consumption, if you like, excess substrate supply. And I see that as basically driving liver metabolism abnormally, including fat deposition. And that, of course, is aided by development of insulin resistance, higher insulin delivery into the liver, which drives fatty acid synthetase. So the whole of fat metabolism in the liver goes wrong, and that drives liver inflammation. We have a lot of evidence of that, and that in turn drives systemic inflammation, vascular inflammation, measured as CRP or microalbuminuria. And that in turn, I think, drives a whole host of the organ damage I see increase, particularly in people with type 2 diabetes, or whether it's from macular degeneration to myocardial infarctions, to all kinds of other things. And that the inflammation worsens with age. We've just heard some of the evidence, of course, has been emphasized by the COVID-19 or the serious COVID-19 experience. Now, there are problems here. I mean, it's difficult, as already been said, to untangle elements of diet observationally. Just think of the Mediterranean diet. Is it the vegetables? Is it the seafood? Is it the fruit? Is it the olive oil? Is it even the red wine and its contents? It's really impossible to untangle those kind of things. And I think it's equally impossible to untangle, for example, cattle fats from excess calorie intake itself. I would like to think that hunter-gatherer communities, agricultural communities with high physical activity do not develop as much vascular inflammation in age. But again, we have observational problems, because of course, those populations have reduced life expectancy from other causes, preventing our understanding. But there are some bad partners around, and I think we have evidence of that, notably the fructose story driving direct access to glycolysis and fat synthesis in the liver, and a very recent paper suggesting it actually drives gut uptake of fats. We have the trans fat story, which is quite convincing. And we know from a long time ago from the UK diet of the last great war in 39 to 45, that if you put in place a nutritionally balanced diet with all the essential nutritions, but no excess calorie, then life expectancy and health begins to improve quite acutely. There's further evidence recently on that from the people in the Netherlands, the Dutch. They've started to shrink again. They're no longer becoming taller with each year. They're actually getting slightly shorter, and yet they're seeing excess calorie consumption. So it's not simply excess calories which metabolism likes. It's obviously the right kind of balanced diet as well. So I think the story that calorie availability leads to active and increased maturity earlier is good, but it does depend on quality of diet and not just calorie intake. It might be expected then that a poor quality diet, whatever that means, will lead to later maturity, but of course, because it will lead to earlier deterioration in health with increased vascular inflammation in aging, you will see reduced quality of health in older age. And that leads me to my last point. I think we have to be careful how we measure this. I've said this before, but there's a tendency to think of health span as being like lifespan, as having a categorical ending. Whereas my own personal experience and my experience of looking at my patients is that that's not what happens. It's deterioration in a lot of different organ systems, basically referable largely to vascular inflammation that's occurring. And it's a kind of quality span that we need to be looking at rather than a health span as a categorical endpoint. So I believe there is much to be gained here by looking at quality of diet, a lot of commercial potential here, but it's going to be very difficult to collect the evidence and to put into place the evidence to back that up in any proper sense. Thank you for listening.
Philip, thank you. That was really appreciate that overview, and you provided a perfect segue to our next panelist, David Ludwig, because you raised the issue of diet quality, and David is now going to take the issue of diet quality, I think, a little further. David?
Okay, am I visible?
You are visible, and your screen and your shared screen is visible.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Michael, for the invitation. And as you mentioned, the Phillips have nicely laid the foundations for my brief remarks. In the next 4 minutes, I'd like to take a few pokes at how we think about energy balance. The first law of thermodynamics was originally formulated by this German, Rudolf Clausius, as energy can neither be created nor destroyed. Applied to biological systems gives us the familiar equation, calorie intake minus expenditure equals calories stored, or fat stored, which is the main storage organ for excess calories in the human body. Now, this notion of energy balance underlies how we think about obesity. A Google search retrieves 12 million hits. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute informs the public that more calories in than out equals weight gain, whereas more calories out than in equals weight loss. And this theme is reflected in the major society statements. An obesity association says, at the simplest level, obesity develops as a result of a period of chronic energy imbalance. A dietetic association says, treating obesity requires achieving a state of negative energy balance. And an endocrine association says, underlying all dietary approaches, however, is the fact that to lose weight, energy balance must be negative. The problem is, equating a positive energy balance with fat storage is a tautology. It doesn't tell us anything meaningful about biology. So let's consider fever. Would we conceptualize fever as a problem of heat balance? Too much heat in the body, not enough heat out of the body. Of course, a fever can only occur if the body generates more heat than it dissipates. But this is a simple fact of physics that hasn't been in debate for 150 years. We don't have to restate this principle of physics at the beginning of every textbook on fever, nor do we need to instruct the public or patients on this principle when we consider how to treat fever. So the issue is cause and effect. And if we're going to consider cause and effect, we have to eliminate that equal sign, which is physics, and consider biology, which involves directionality. So one possibility is that a positive calorie balance drives fat storage. But another possibility that is just as compatible with the first law of thermodynamics is that increased fat storage drives a positive calorie balance. Consider the example of an adolescent growth spurt. A teenager might consume hundreds or 1,000 calories more than he or she did just a few years ago. But does this relative overeating drive growth, or does rapid growth with the uptake of calories and deposition into body tissue, new body tissue, cause the adolescent to get hungry and overeat? So these possibilities have diametrically different physiological implications to how we understand growth and how we treat growth disorders. Now, coming back to obesity, the conventional way of thinking is with the arrows flowing left to right, a positive calorie balance in the context of our modern food environment with energy-dense, very tasty foods. Leads us to overconsume. We don't burn those calories off with our sedentary lifestyle. They get forced into fat and we gain weight. So from this perspective, it makes sense to tell people to eat less and move more because it's focused on the putative cause. But the other possibility is that we've had causality reversed, that increasing fat storage is driving a positive energy balance. Now, if that's the case, then eating less and moving more is by definition symptomatic treatment. It's downstream and unlikely to work. According to the carbohydrate insulin model, we need to think about the factors that are affecting substrate partitioning and deposition into fat cells. In particular, according to this model, and I won't review it in detail, the processed carbohydrates that entered the diet during the low-fat years raise the insulin to glucagon ratio that promotes relatively more deposition of calories into fat, depriving the rest of the body of calories. And that in turn triggers hunger, drives overeating. If we restrict calories, it suppresses energy expenditure. I'll just briefly note that this is not just about carbohydrates. It's an intellectual infrastructure for thinking about how many biological and environmental factors could influence body weight by affecting the fat cell primarily and energy balances downstream. Now, lastly, I'll just point out that I and 16 co-authors have just published a full formulation of this model in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. It's open access, full text, so feel free to download it and see what you think. And I look forward to seeing how these different ways of interpreting energy balance might inform our discussion today.
Muted. Thank you very much, David. And if that article is not already posted to the Catalyst campus, we'll try to make sure it gets posted there shortly so that it's available for all. So working backwards then, since I've already got you on my screen front and center, you've described, let me back up. Can you comment on what is commonly referred to as low carbohydrate diets, i.e. higher fat diets, versus changing the carbohydrate quality? So if one were to, based on this insulin model, if one were to select a diet that was say 45% or 50% carbohydrates, all of which were low glycemic index, would that get us there, or do we need to go to a diet that is arguably 25 or less percent, or 30% or less carbohydrate?
Yeah, let me answer that question, but just I would feel better if I pointed out that there's a third possibility, which is that both of these models, both directionality, applies for some people under some conditions at some stages of their life. So this is not necessarily an either or, and that clearly not everybody will benefit to the same degree from carbohydrate restriction versus fat restriction. But the model argues that a key driver is glycemic load, because glycemic load is the best descriptor of how blood sugar changes in the postprandial state. And that rapid rise of blood sugar leads to both increased insulin, I mean, that's endocrinology 101, but also suppression of glucagon. Now, glucagon does the opposite of insulin. It's a catabolic hormone. Insulin is an anabolic. So if you have one going up and the other going down, it leads to a massively greater anabolic stimulus. And that's going to promote uptake of nutrients in the early postprandial phase and restrain release of nutrients in the late postprandial phase, potentially explaining why people get hungry sooner. Not everybody is going to be equally susceptible, but then coming back to your question, there are two ways to lower glycemic load. And one is by, maybe more of a sledgehammer approach, just reduce all carbohydrates, and that will do it. The other is to reduce the glycemic index. So these are the mostly refined grains, potato products, and added sugars. These are the things that we were told to actually eat more of during the low-fat years. I mean, literally, the notion was that you couldn't overeat on carbohydrates, and that sugar was go back to the statements, sugar was a good way of displacing fat calories. I think Dr. Holm is nodding, and he probably remembers some of these statements. We understand that that was way too simplistic, but that that one can reduce glycemic load substantially without eliminating carbohydrate, just by emphasizing the whole fruits, legumes, minimally processed grains, and then encouraging healthful fats. Some of these fats like olive oil, nuts, avocado, full-fat yogurt, even dark chocolate. These are the highest energy-dense foods that we have. According to an earlier version of the energy balance model, that would be a caloric nightmare. And yet none of these foods seem to increase risk for obesity and chronic disease, quite the opposite.
Thank you. So David, I asked the question because on the one hand, you saw in my slides reference to the Chinese nutrition transition. And certainly prior to that transition, you were not looking at a nation with a diet that was high in fat. In fact, it was quite a high carbohydrate diet, but it was the sort of carbohydrates that you have just defined. They were minimally or unprocessed and low glycemic load, or low glycemic index, if you prefer, carbohydrates. But I also asked the question because concomitantly, or almost concomitantly, with the paper you just mentioned that you published another paper. I think it was also in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And it was a clinical trial looking at the effects of saturated fats. And I don't have the paper in front of me, but my recollection was that it showed either benefit or at least no harm in terms of cardiometabolic risk. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, these two papers came out within a couple of weeks of each other. I guess in the pandemic, with all of our research on hold, we're writing a lot of papers and analyzing data that have been needing to get forth. So this was a large feeding study. We had 164 participants who were fed all of their meals for an academic year in collaboration with Framingham State University. So we fed over 100,000 meals during the trial. The primary outcome was on energy expenditure, published in BMJ a few years ago. Mm-hmm. In this study, we compared, the comparison was 20, 40, or 60% carbohydrate diets with 60, 40, or 20% fat. Protein held at 20% across the board. This was during weight stability over 5 months. And we found that the low carb diet, 20% carbohydrate, just as we were discussing before, they're still eating fruits, some beans, by no means a ketogenic diet, but that diet had 3 times the saturated fat that's conventionally recommended for at-risk people. It had 21% saturated fat, and we found that LDL cholesterol, which was the big concern about low-carb diets, did not increase. Neither did particle number or particle size. Whereas there was a range of benefits to the low-carb diet for lipoprotein-associated dyslipidemia, insulin-resistant associated dyslipidemia. So an outcome called lipoprotein insulin resistance, which is a composite measure, improved. LP(a) improved, as did adiponectin.
So thank you. And just as a comment to you, and you may or may not have a response, but also to the rest of the panelists that I'd like to bring in. When we talk about low fat, high fat, we have a problem. And the problem is you can't change one macronutrient. If you change one if you change fat, you have to change carbohydrate, protein, or both. Let's leave alcohol out as a wild card. We're not going to use it to balance things out. So one could just as well make an argument for adjusting carbohydrate downward with more modest increases in fat and increasing protein. Or even not increasing fat.
Absolutely. And kind of a low carb diet is a high protein diet. You can replace the carbohydrate with either. Protein increases insulin. It's an insulin secretagogue. But what protein does, in contrast to carbohydrate, is it raises glucagon as opposed to suppress glucagon. So it's a different way of lowering the insulin to glucagon ratio. And I don't think we yet know what is most efficacious and for what outcomes. I suspect more protein is going to be helpful to at least the acute phase of weight loss. As to the long-term health, including cancer-related outcomes, I'm not sure whether there's going to be benefits to an absolute reduction of insulin as one would optimally get on a low-carb, moderate protein rather than high-protein diet. But it's too soon to know.
Thank you. Let me bring the other panelists in, Philippe, and John. Any comments on this before I prod you with my next question?
Yeah, can I just comment? I mean, I agree with a lot of what is being said there by David, and I like the studies, and certainly things like the absorption profiles of different foods make a huge difference. And of course, in real life practice, palatability does too, and that can make a huge difference if you change a balance of diet. Where I possibly don't agree is in centralizing my interest on glucagon. I think it's not that. I think it's intrinsic metabolism that is being affected, particularly within the liver, and that does matter. And I think also we have to be very careful. Calories which go into peripheral adipose tissue are not the same metabolically as going to central adipose tissue, simply because the metabolic activity of those tissues is different. So of course, if you direct calories into peripheral fat, people put on weight, as you do with thiazolidine downs, compared to centrally. So there are some subtle issues there around different types of fat too.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to pause for just a second. I'm getting a message that there are participants who have raised hands. I don't see them, unfortunately. So I'm just going to ask if there are people attending who have a question, please put it in the question box. Thank you. And now I will return. I'm sorry for that interruption. Comments from John or Philippe on the same topic?
Well, maybe just coming back to the question, that you raised very nicely, like if you reduce one macronutrient, you have to get the other one up, and there's probably not, one solution fits all, especially when it comes to protein intake. There are studies that bring up the concept that maybe there's a tipping point with age where, it makes sense to increase the protein intake. And if you go to a younger age, I agree with what David said. I think high protein can help control satiety, can help during the weight loss. But there's also data showing now that increasing protein too much, you get into, to increased cardiovascular risk at some point. And this is backed up, from many preclinical studies coming actually from aging research, where protein triggers mTOR and then downstream aging pathways, and then potentially having impact on cancer as well. So yes, I think it's not an easy solution. So it will depend on age and many other factors, which ratio may be best for you.
Yeah, we have a long way to go on this. So as long as I have your attention, I'm wondering if I can get you to comment a little further on the notion of fasting versus caloric restriction, and indeed intermittent fasting versus time-restricted eating.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think because you this was part of your introduction, I think maybe just as the first point to set the stage, I don't think today intermittent fasting is there in terms of the clinical evidence to have a conclusive idea if it has similar benefits to caloric restriction. There are many studies now. The complexity with intermittent fasting is that there's so many different protocols. And even within the protocols, if you think of 16/8, You can think of breakfast skipping, you can think of dinner skipping. So it gets very complex if it's about generating the clinical evidence. And today, most studies, almost all studies, are relatively small cohort sizes and relatively short when you compare it to the history of caloric restriction. So I think this is the first point to make. I don't think that, and happy to discuss, but I don't think today we have a conclusive answer. The other aspect here, and what I want to bring forward is that for me, it's not a question either or. In the end, when it comes to managing weight, it's whatever works for the patient or the consumer. In the end, it's a question of adherence. Can you stick with it or can you not stick with it? And so for me, intermittent fasting and the different protocols are just a huge advancement in terms of the potential solutions you can give, and there's a strong component that I believe is there in intermittent fasting, which is about helping to induce behavior changes. The moment you start being conscious about when you eat, you become conscious again how many times we were snacking. You go to the cafeteria and there are cookies on the table. You take the cookie, you eat it. You don't even realize the moment where you have a notion of chrononutrition and you say, I'm not eating between these meals. It's probably already a huge step forward. And then it doesn't. Then the second step, yes, maybe 16/8 is better for long-term cardiovascular health. 5+2, 5 days eating, 2 days of reduced calories, maybe better for weight loss. We will see in the future, but I think it's already this component of being aware of how you eat, when you eat, and how you can use it to have a better adherence. I think this will make a difference already.
So whether or not there is a discrete benefit over and above the actual restriction of calories remains to be seen, but you would say that it is a great tool to get you to caloric restriction, and additional benefits are to be determined.
I think the promise is that the adherence will be easier than calorie counting. It's very hard to do, actually, to count calories on a daily basis, even for professionals. So, but so in this sense, yes, this is what I think. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions for John, but before I get to them, I'm going to keep you on the spot for one more moment. You showed that slide of older versus younger individuals. And that was a very interesting slide. It made me think a little bit of a study that actually in a morning session, Jerry Schulman mentioned, of younger individuals with healthy BMI who are nonetheless insulin resistant. And so my question is are the findings that you showed in your last slide simply the result of age, or is it secondary to a shift to visceral fat, a greater visceral versus subcutaneous fat distribution, perhaps higher liver fat? I'm sure you didn't control for that, but is that a possibility?
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly. I think, and there was actually a question in the chat that I saw, what about the high variability or,
Yes.
in the older cohort? And I think, with older age, there are a lot of things that happen physiologically. So it's just there are many different, even if you, like we did, control the recruitment to have a really healthy cohort, there's still many, many reasons why people are insulin resistant or not. So, with this study, we cannot comment what the driver is, but I think finding tools when we look into what we call healthy older generations to see who is at risk and for what, using biomarkers to stratify and to guide, proactive health management choices, this will be the way to go in the future.
Thank you. I understand that John is going to have to go. I want to get a question directed to him before he does. John, you made a compelling case for shifting towards a lower sodium diet, but I know you take a public health approach, and I know that you made strong reference for collinearity and for non-causality. So my question to you is this: are higher sodium diets that are also lower by virtue of them tending to be more processed? Are they diets that are lower in magnesium, potassium, and calcium? And to what extent are the effects of higher sodium? I'm not referring to somebody who already has high blood pressure, but healthy individuals. To what extent are the potential deficits, if you will, of a high sodium diet the result of the sodium itself or of insufficient potassium, calcium, and or magnesium?
Probably the biggest cation that's been shown to modulate the effect of sodium at higher levels of intake is potassium.
Mm-hmm.
And you can take Black individuals, white individuals, get them on 80, 90, 100, 110 milliequivalents of potassium a day. And those who are sodium sensitive will lose their sodium sensitivity. The potassium helps with the natriuresis. And really, it just appears to blunt the effect of sodium. The other nutrients I'm not so sure of, but I do know that potassium is the big one. And I think a trick is how do we take all this information and get people to consume the right kind of diet? So you can say, well, eat a high potassium diet, eat low sodium diet. What's really missing for the end user, the consumer, and even probably practitioners like myself is how do you do that? How do you take those recommendations, and then what are the things you take off the smorgasbord and put together to make a diet that maybe is 3 grams, 2.5, 3 grams of sodium, but also higher than average on dietary potassium intake? And I think some of it's just translation. I mean, everybody on here knows about the individual nutrients and what this means, et cetera, et cetera. But boy, you start getting away from the experts and say, how do you actually make this happen? And so I think that part of our focus might shift more from single nutrients to really figuring out what are combined nutrients. What's the best sodium, potassium sort of configuration in the diet that's associated with the best health? I'm very skeptical about some of these diets, some of these epidemiologic studies that show risk really high in people with low sodium intake, because that's a very heterogeneous group. You got people down there who are either not even clinically ill, but subclinically ill. And part of it, sodium is so correlated with calories that if you get down into that part of the diet range, you're dealing with some really healthy people and some probably really sick people, a very, very mixed bag. And so I think that we got to pay attention to it, but I don't find that very compelling, particularly since nobody can really show me from a physiologic perspective why you need 150 millimoles of sodium a day. Okay. I can't figure it out if you got normal kidneys, why you need that much. The Yanomamo Indians, low sodium intake, people will point out, well, they live long. They don't live very long. They don't live as long. But one of the things you don't see in societies with low sodium intake is the age-related rise in blood pressure. Okay. And again, I think, is it for everybody, or should we focus on higher risk people? Right now, Mike, we really don't have a public health approach in this country to be able to control the food supply for the entire population. So we can almost forget that.
Well, John, let me reframe, since you said you made a compelling case to avoid single nutrients and engage in practical translation. So if we were to talk about a Mediterranean type diet, rich in fruits and vegetables, there's your potassium. Rich in nuts, there's your magnesium. And that would probably be replacing some of the processed foods that were high in sodium, but there would still be more than 1,500 milligrams of sodium in that kind of diet.
Well, the average adult in the U.S. is taking in around 3.5 to 4 grams of sodium a day, and multiply grams by 43.5, and that gives you those millimoles. Even epidemiologic studies say that you're probably fine down to 3. grams. And I think below that, there's some clear false signals being sent out. So I think for the issue of palatability, a lot of people, the Mediterranean diet is really not necessarily going to be in their wheelhouse. Okay. For some people, it will be. And I think it's great. But for those that's not in their wheelhouse, how do we help them construct a diet that can mimic the nutrient content? And here somebody in the chat says, yeah, there are lots of high potassium, low sodium foods. And that's absolutely correct.
Right. All right. Well, so
high sodium, high potassium, low sodium foods.
Could I ask there? I mean, you
Please.
described them as not being in the wheelhouse, but it's the problem that that when people grow up, they aren't trained. I don't mean that in a nasty sense. They aren't trained to find such diets palatable. And, you know, if people from age 3 were brought up on such diets, we have a completely different situation where they desire those diets.
We might, but in my neighborhood, there was no such thing as a Mediterranean diet. It was beef, fried stuff, this, that, and the other. So by the time I was a young man, my palate had already been set.
Why? Why?
Now as an old man, I've learned how to adjust my palate, or I'd probably be 300 pounds now.
You're unusual.
Yeah. So, I think that we've got to have ways to hit people's palate with combinations of foods that help us get to a similar endpoint.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. So let me go to our final question. And John, we've just been talking about it, but for the rest of the group, have we missed the mark on our public health guidelines with respect to sugar? Sodium we just spoke about, but with regard to sugar and fat. I see there's a question, is sugar truly addictive, or is this a psychological phenomenon? So that will certainly relate to this question. But have we missed the mark with regard to sugar and fat? Have we been overly aggressive in restricting dietary fat, and especially saturated fat? And does the evidence support it? And have we been too easy, if you will, on our recommendations for sugar? Philip?
Well, I mean, I think we have been too easy on the recommendations for sugar, and particularly though, not so much because I think sugar is a bad thing, and it is, but because it's such an easy thing to get into foods in such large quantities, that it's something that one can actually attack successfully, and therefore is useful translationally because you begin to do something about it. I think it is much more difficult to do that with fats, and particularly, sadly, with beef, dairy fats, because of partly the palatability issues. But come on, we've never missed the mark. We're in an evolving situation with our public health guidelines. They move along, they move slowly, they don't go backwards. And what we're trying to do is to keep them moving in a direction which is going to be beneficial to the population. So it's not a question of missing marks, it's a question of perhaps trying to nudge things along a bit faster.
So that comment would certainly go for sugar. What about saturated fat? There's been a clamoring for questioning the evidence in support of the saturated fat cardiovascular disease hypothesis.
Yeah, well, from my perspective, that is perfectly reasonable. I mean, part of the problem has been concentration on the wrong lipids in the blood, I think. But, you know, I don't think the evidence is in there, hardly, but fats contain a lot of calories, as has been said, and they're an easy way of getting a lot of calories in. let's face it, people slap them in. And I think, therefore, while I'm not very anti-saturated fats as such, fats are a problem.
So let me drill and push a little bit on that point. Using the same paradigm as I mentioned earlier, we have three macronutrients to work with: fat, carbohydrate, and protein. If we try to limit fat intake, what are we going to replace it with?
But one answer is nothing.
Aha.
I mean,
So
you need to cut the total substrate load which our livers are seeing, and that's the desirable thing to do. Simply to cut the substrate load.
So to reframe, you would be okay.
David.
Oh, David, were you?
Yeah, I would just if I could jump in for a sec.
Please.
Just one thing, a couple of things. I do want to say, in my view, saturated fat on a conventional high carbohydrate diet is clearly harmful. You know, the combination of carbohydrate, bread and butter is not good. The bread raises insulin. That saturated fat is going to be oxidized less, and it's going to raise serum saturated fat. But as Jeff Volek and others have shown, on a low carbohydrate diet, even with high levels of saturated fat, it gets burned quickly and you don't raise your serum saturated fat. And in fact, high carb diets through de novo lipogenesis raise a very high risk panel. So we've got to distinguish saturated fat on a standard diet. Let's not, I think that's clear. It's not helpful, but we may be blaming butter for the problem that the bread produced.
So, good point.
And then in terms of just cutting out fat, well, we actually, Philip, we tried that. It was called the low-fat diet of the 1980s and 1990s. When you just cut out fat, people get hungry. Now, admittedly, you know, there were a lot of unhelpful products that got promoted, you know, the low-fat Twinkies and the fat-free half and half and the like. But my concern is that when you cut back on fat, you're going to have to replace it with something. And on a population basis, it's not going to be fruits and vegetables.
So along those lines, let me just read you a comment, and you've probably seen it already, but ask for your reaction. And by you, I mean the entire panel, to a comment from Vivian Lowe. Just a comment: we talk about the Mediterranean diet as if it were quantified. I have several staff who are from the Mediterranean, and their home diets are far from our conception of the Mediterranean diet. And it is generally moderate or high in fat, so it's always puzzling to me when healthcare providers recommend a low-fat Mediterranean diet.
Yes.
Well,
you know, I mean, it's unrefined carbohydrate, but it will contain fish oils and it will contain olive oil. I mean, what's the problem?
Probably low saturated fat, but that's probably what people are hinting at, particularly those who are not experts in the field. But it's high in monosaturated fats, and it's probably good for you.
You know, going back to a comment you made earlier, John, one of the things that was beaten into my head decades ago is we don't eat nutrients, we eat foods. And it's a simple statement, but it goes to your point of not talking about potassium or magnesium or saturated fat or monounsaturated, but making clear, coherent food recommendations. And perhaps we've missed the mark on doing that.
But I mean, hold on, we've got to distinguish the science, really, that leads us to understand what should go into the foods which we put in our recommendations, and the foods. And so those two things are both relevant in their different areas. Experimentally, we need to look at the components.
Oh, Philip, I absolutely agree.
Sure.
I was making reference to consumer-facing comments. How do you translate this so that people actually know what to eat?
I mean, it's like you want to make sure every part you put in the car is really, really good, but at some point, for the car to move, you got to put it all together, and to get it out of the lab, and also the science tells us which parts to pull both together to build something that we can take out of the lab that can translate into something at least people can have some options for their palate to achieve similar goals.
But it does raise a question commercially, of course, and that's whether it's possible to come up with more healthy diets which have desirable palatability qualities. So that we shouldn't attack not the nutrient content and mix, but actually the palatability to support that.
It's a business opportunity for someone.
Indeed. I'm going to ask, I see we are running to the very end of our allotted time. 1 minute final comment from each of our panelists. Philippe?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can go back to a question that Thomas put in the chat. Like he asked, like, how can one make money out of intermittent fasting? And I think it's it's a good question, but I think one thing that where we have to depart from is today consumers are not looking for a problem solution coupling anymore. You know, I have like a knee pain, what's the solution for it? But more of a holistic approach to health management. And, you know, just as an example, I mean, we have supplements for mitochondria, longevity supplements, but they don't work in isolation, right? So, and some of the benefits overlap with fasting. So it's really, you know, giving the consumers a toolbox for what works for them. And if they want to use a supplement to, you know, have benefits, that's great. But it's overall more of a question, you know, how can one manage their own health at a way that works for them and they can stick to it. And fasting is one solution. Exercise should be part of everyone's lifestyle and so on. So it's a really holistic approach to longevity and aging.
Thank you. David?
Yes, in any controversial topic in nutrition, there's oftentimes going to be a middle ground. And one way of finding that is to consider effect modification and susceptible populations. We considered the possibility that the combination of refined carbohydrates or sugar and saturated fat is a bad one. And on that background, you know, saturated fat looks bad. On a low carb diet, saturated fat may look much less bad, may look relatively neutral, just part of a diet that doesn't increase risk. I don't know if John Flack will agree, but there's also a potential effect modification with salt, that on a low carbohydrate diet, insulin levels drop. Insulin is a well-known salt retaining hormone. We used to have something, you know, in the old days, insulin edema when we had old preparations. So that individuals on a low, the classic low carb diets would give people 5 grams of sodium a day to prevent hypotension. So again, there may be ways that we can integrate seemingly, and I agree totally with John that on a standard American diet, a lot of sodium is going to raise risk, but there may be ways of integrating disparate findings and finding paths that will allow for a broader range of healthful possibilities.
Thank you. John?
Not going to say much. I don't disagree with David in what he just said. The effect modification, for example, with potassium, potentially with insulin, is certainly a possibility. And I just want to see us move from the really good science in really trying to package some of the stuff that the best we know of today, and it may change down the road, to really help us who also practice, and for the patients, consumers, to really take more charge of their life and from a diet perspective in a way with straightforward guidance on how to put the diets together that fit their palate.
Perfect. Thank you. Philip?
Yeah, my comment would be, we've strayed a little bit from aging, haven't we? And I do like very much very good comments about, you know, inflammation and excess inflammation with age. And you heard that from myself as well. And I think scientifically, I would like to see more studies which focus on measures and markers of vascular and liver inflammation with different foods and different food mixes, rather than what we have been looking at.
Agreed. I would love to see those studies as well. Getting them funded is a big hill to climb sometimes. But with that, I believe we are at time. I had a note from Thomas that I could go to 4:20, and it's 4:21. So I want to thank this incredible panel. This has been enlightening and every bit as robust as I hoped it would be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
very much.
very much, Michael, and the panel.